the video Spring Security secure REST APIs using HTTP basic authentication with in-memory users. I am Nam Haming at CodeJava.net. Throughout this video, you will learn understand HTTP basic authentication, use Spring Security to secure an existing REST API with HTTP basic authentication and with credentials stored in memory with plaintext passwords, and you will also learn how to test HTTP basic authentication for REST API with web browser called Postman, and how to code automated test with Spring Security test. Firstly, let's understand the details of HTTP basic authentication. You know, HTTP basic is the simplest authentication technique to secure web resources, including REST APIs. It does not require cookies, session identifiers, or login pages. HTTP basic authentication uses standard fields in HTTP header to exchange credentials. The pros are HTTP basic authentication is simple and quick to implement. It is understood by any HTTP compliant clients. The cons are username and password are encoded in base64 format, not encrypted, so it's very insecure unless the exchange is over a secure connection, such as HTTPS, TLS, and no standard method to log out users. This sequence diagram explains how HTTP basic authentication works between a client and a server. You see, firstly, a client sends a GET request to the server to access protected resources. If the resources require authentication, then the server returns the status for one unauthorized with the header www-authenticate : and basic RAM equal any string. And then based on the header information here, the client should ask the user to provide username and password, typically in a login dialog box in web browser. And then the client sends another GET request to access the protected resource with the header authorization basic, and then the basic for encoding of the combination of username and password. And on the server side, it checks the credentials valid or not. If the credentials are valid, the server returns status to our OK with the protected resource. Else, if the credentials are invalid, the server returns status for one unauthorized. So that's basically how HTTP basic authentication works. And note that the client sends the credentials in the authorization header as base64 encoding of username and password joined by a colon. That means username and password cannot contain colons. And the RAM here in the www authenticate header in the request, it is used to describe the protected area or to indicate the scope of protection. Let me show you an existing Java Spring Boot project in which I implement a very simple REST API, kind of Hello World REST API. You see, I have a controller class annotated with the REST controller annotation and a handler method for the context root of the application. It returns a string Hello World REST API. Now let me start this application to test this Hello World REST API using web browser. Okay, the server started. So I use Chrome to test localhost port number 8080. You see, it returns Hello World REST API. And if you open the developer tools, you can see the details of request and response. Let me refresh. You see the details of request and response status to our okay. Now let me update the project to secure this API with HTTP basic authentication. So firstly, I need to update the project dependencies, the form.xml file, to add the dependency of Spring Security. Yeah, you can see that I use the Spring Boot version 3.2.4, and we need to add the Spring Boot starter security artifact here. Okay, and when Spring Security is present in the class path, it will secure the APIs by default, the application by default. So if I make a GET request here, sorry, let me check Spring Security. Let me restart the application. Okay, and refresh the API here, and you see it shows login page as Spring Security secures the application by default. You see status 302 file and redirected to the login page here. So in the next few minutes, I will show you how to update the code to enable HTTP authentication instead of form login page like this. Let me update the code in the REST API here to return a hello world message followed by the name of the authenticated user. So I add a parameter to this handler method principal here, and instead of hello world REST API, I change the return message is hello world and the name of the authenticated user. So we write principal get name. Okay, and then we need to create a new Spring Security configuration class for the application, for the project security config. Okay, and we need to use the configuration annotation for this configuration class, and we declare a bin of type security filter chain to configure HTTP security. Return http.build. And now we configure HTTP security to enable HTTP authentication, HTTP basic authentication. So we call HTTP authorize HTTP request of any request authenticated, and then we should disable session management for REST API. Session management SM session creation policy, session creation policy state list. Okay, and also should disable CSRF disable, and now enable HTTP basic authentication with default customizer. with defaults. The default configuration of HTTP basic by Spring Security is enough for almost any use cases with HTTP basic. Okay, so very simple. Just write this code to enable HTTP basic authentication. Now let me test out the API. Restart the application. Okay, and if I refresh back the get request to the application, I see the sign dialog box here is asking me to provide username and password. That means HTTP basic authentication is working, and I need to provide valid credentials to sign in. For now, just click cancel. Okay, and I got the error 401 unauthorized. Now let's see the details of request and response. And you can see in the request it has the header www authenticate, and the value is basic RAM and RAM name here. That means the server requires HTTP basic authentication. Now let me update the code to specify some credentials in memory. So in this security configuration class, we declare another bin of type user details service, user details service, user details service, and here we declare some user from Spring Security. User1 equal user with username, for example admin, and password we use plain text password without encoding, so we need to specify the prefix in the password is like this, noob like this, and password is Ninda, and build. Okay, and return new in memory user details manager, passing the collection of user. For now we just have one user 1 here. User details, sorry, it should be user details, user 1. Okay, so we specify one user in memory user with the name is admin and password Ninda. Now let me test the REST API. Okay, now I enter correct username admin, password Ninda, sign in, and you see it works, and it returns the response, hello world admin. Admin is the name of the authenticated user, and you can see the details of the request and response here in the response header. In the response header, in the request header, you can see it sends the authorization header with the value is basic, and then the basic default encoding of the username and password. Let me copy and use basic default decoder to check. Basic default decode, paste here and click decode, and you can see the result is admin Ninda. That means this encoded string is the basic default encoding of the combination of username and password separated by colon, you see. So we understand the HTTP basic authentication works, right? Now let me try to add another user here with the name is nam hm. Password is 1 2 3 4 5 6. User 2. User 2. Okay, and restart the application and test the API again. And you can see it still have the user authenticated and no standard way to log out the user. Next, I'm going to show you how to test HTTP basic authentication for this REST API using curl command line tool. So let me update the code here. Instead of using customizer with default, I customize the realm name HTTP basic like this. So if you want to customize HTTP basic authentication, you can use lambda expression like this. You can see the available methods here to customize. I just want to change the default RAM name to a custom one. For example, my RAM. Okay. And open a terminal window to use the command line to curl to test out the API. Okay, so type curl localhost 8080-v, and you see this is the details of the request get and the response for a one unauthorized. The server sends the header www authenticate basic RAM, and RAM name is my RAM. You see. Now to authenticate user in command line using curl, we need to specify the username and password via the flag -u like this. For example, nam hm 1 2 3 4 5 6 and endpoint localhost. You see, now I got the status to OO successful and the response body hello world nam hm. That means HTTP basic authentication is working. And let me use another username curl admin name that one, and I use incorrect password, and then I should get for a one. Here you see the server returns status for a one unauthorized. Now I need to provide correct username and password. Okay, successful. You see to our okay, and the response body hello world admin. So it's very simple to test HTTP basic authentication using curl. Just specify username and password separated by colon here, and you can see in the authorization header of the request it sends the username and password encoded in base 64. Here you see. Next, let me show you how to test HTTP basic authentication for REST APIs using Postman. So I have Postman desktop application here, and let's add a new request in this collection with the HTTP method is get and API endpoint is localhost 8080. The request name is HTTP basic authentication. If I click send now, I got status for one unauthorized, and you can see in the header of the response the server sends the header www authenticate basic RAM equal my RAM. That means the client must supply username and password in form of HTTP basic authentication to access the protected resource. So in the request here, click authorization and specify the type is basic auth, specify username. This here wrong password, so if I click send now, I also got 401 unauthorized, but in the request header you can see it sends the authorization header with value is basic and then the basic default encoding of username and password. Let me update password to correct one. Okay, click send now and you see it works. I got the status to our okay. You can see the body here, hello world, now HM. Let me enter another user, admin, and name that. Click send. You see, it works. Hello world, admin. So that's very simple to test HTTP basic authentication for REST APIs using Postman, as you have seen. Next, I'm going to show you how to write some unit tests to test the API with HTTP basic authentication. So let's create a new Java class under the test source directory, new class, and the class name is home controller test because it is actually unit testing for controller layer, and we use the web MVC test annotation and load the controller class is home controller dot class. It is here. It has only one handler method, welcome. Okay, and in this test class we need to have auto-wire reference to mock MVC object to perform HTTP request MVC. And the first test method is should return 401 because no credentials in the request. And we define the request URI here as a string. Static final string request URI is the context root of the application slash. It should match the mapping URL here. Okay, and then we use the mock MVC object to perform a GET request URI. And we expect the status is 401 unauthorized is unauthorized. Sorry. Okay, and now we can run this test. Run as JUnit test. You see the test is successful, but in the console, if you see the message using generated security password, that means the Spring security configuration class was not loaded for this test. So we need to use the import annotation to import the security configuration class, security config.class, and run the test again. And also we want to see the details of the request and response, so we and do print to print the details of request and response. Okay, and run the test again. Run. This is a simplest test case. Okay, now you see the details of request URI slash header empty, and the response details here you can see the status for 01 unauthorized, and you can see the header www authenticate basic RAM equal my RAM. That means the Spring security configuration class was loaded for this test. Makes sense? That's the first test case. And let me code the second one. The second one, the name is should return 200 because valid credentials. Okay, and now we specify username and password. String username equal admin and password equal Ninda. Okay, and we need to have Spring security test dependency here. So we declare another dependency for Spring security test with the group ID is .springframework.security, and artifact ID is Spring security test. Security test. Okay, and then in the test method we can write the code like this with after get and HTTP basic here, and passing username and password. Okay, very simple, and then we expect the status is okay. Okay, and run this test. Run as JV test. Okay, you see the test is successful, and you can see in the header of the request it has the header authorization basic, and then the basic for encoding of the username and password, and you can see the response status to okay, and you can see the body of the response here, hello world admin. Admin is the name of the authenticated user. That means HTTP basic authentication is working properly, is implemented properly in the controller layer. Okay, and the last test we can write is for the case that we use invalid credentials. So return 401 because invalid credentials we specify wrong password, and expect status is unauthorized. Okay, and run the test. Run as JV test. You see the test is successful. You can see the details of the response status 401 and unauthorized here. You see in the header of the request here it send username and password encoded in basic default, but the password is wrong. So that's how to write unit test for testing HTTP basic authentication with REST APIs. Okay, so far you have learned how to secure REST APIs using HTTP basic authentication with in-memory users. I hope you found this video helpful. Please subscribe to my channel, like, comment, and share this video. Thanks for watching.